As the sun sank below the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the pristine lawns of Beverly Hills, Jonathan Greer stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his sleek home office, a tumbler of scotch in hand. The amber liquid caught the last traces of daylight, casting a warm glow that sharply contrasted with the cold emptiness gnawing at him. At 45, Jonathan was at the peak of his career, a tech titan whose name commanded respect in Silicon Valley boardrooms and whose face adorned the covers of business magazines. Yet, as he stared out over the vast estate that symbolized his success, a gnawing sense of isolation settled in, one even his wealth couldn't erase. Before we continue, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. The Greer mansion was a marvel of modern architecture, all sleek lines and minimalist design. It boasted 12 bedrooms, 15 bathrooms, a state-of-the-art home theater, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and a garage housing a collection of luxury cars that would make any automobile enthusiast weep with envy. But for all its grandeur, the house felt more like a museum than a home, pristine, untouched, and devoid of the warmth that should come from a family dwelling within its walls. Jonathan took a sip of his drink, savoring the burn as it slid down his throat. He turned away from the window, his eyes scanning the immaculate office. Every surface gleamed, every book and trinket perfectly placed. It was a room designed to impress, to showcase the success of the man who occupied it. But to Jonathan, it felt more like a prison cell, a place where he was trapped by his own ambition and the never-ending pursuit of the next big deal. His gaze fell on a framed photograph on his desk, a rare personal touch in the otherwise impersonal space. It was a family portrait taken 5 years ago. Jonathan, his wife Evelyn, their daughter Mia, and son Jack. They were smiling, the perfect picture of a happy family. But even then, Jonathan could see the strain behind their eyes, the forced nature of their smiles. It was as if the camera had captured the exact moment when the cracks in their family foundation had begun to show. With a heavy sigh, Jonathan set down his glass and picked up the photograph. Evelyn's smile didn't reach her eyes, which held a sadness that he had chosen to ignore for far too long. At 39, she was still strikingly beautiful, with chestnut hair and deep brown eyes that once sparkled with life and laughter. Now, those eyes seemed to have lost their light, dulled by years of neglect and emotional distance. Jonathan's thumb brushed over the image of Mia, who had been 13 at the time the photo was taken. Even then, he could see the beginnings of the withdrawn teenager she would become. Her smile was guarded, her posture slightly turned away from him, as if she was already emotionally retreating from her father's world. And then there was Jack, just 6 years old in the picture, his gap-toothed grin and tousled hair a stark reminder of the innocence that Jonathan had failed to protect. Jack's eyes were bright with adoration, looking up at his father with unabashed hero worship. It was a look that Jonathan hadn't seen in years, replaced now by confusion and hurt whenever he bothered to really look at his son. The sound of laughter drifted up from the garden below, interrupting Jonathan's reverie. He moved back to the window, peering down to see Jack playing with one of the household staff, a young gardener who had taken it upon himself to throw a ball around with the boy when his work was done. Jonathan felt a pang of jealousy and guilt. It should be him down there, laughing and playing with his son, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd done anything so carefree. As he watched, Evelyn appeared on the terrace, calling Jack in for dinner. The boy's shoulders slumped, his disappointment evident even from this distance. Evelyn's eyes drifted up to the office window, meeting Jonathan's gaze for a brief moment. There was no warmth in that look, no invitation for him to join them. It was a look that said she had long ago given up expecting him to be present in their lives. Jonathan turned away, unable to bear the weight of that gaze. He knew he should go down, should join his family for dinner. But the thought filled him with a strange mix of longing and dread. He was more comfortable in board meetings and investor pitches than he was at his own dinner table. When had that happened? When had he become so disconnected from the people who were supposed to matter most? He returned to his desk, his eyes falling on the stack of documents awaiting his attention. There was always more work to be done, always another deal to close, another problem to solve. It was easier to lose himself in the familiar world of business than to face the mess he'd made of his personal life. As he sat down, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a reminder of a critical business dinner scheduled for the following week. Investors from Japan were flying in, and the future of his company's expansion into Asian markets hung in the balance. Jonathan felt a familiar surge of adrenaline at the thought of the high-stakes meeting. This was where he thrived, where he felt most alive. But as he began to review the meeting notes, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he was making a choice, again, to prioritize his work over his family. He pushed the thought away, telling himself that this deal would secure his family's future, would ensure that they would never want for anything. Deep down, though, Jonathan knew that what his family wanted, what they needed, was something he couldn't buy with all his billions. They needed his time, his attention, his love. And those were the very things he had stopped giving them years ago. As the evening wore on, Jonathan remained in his office, poring over spreadsheets and market projections. The sounds of family life drifted up from below, the clinking of dishes, muffled conversations, a burst of laughter that was quickly hushed. Each sound was a reminder of the life he was missing, the connections he had allowed to wither. By the time he finally emerged from his work cocoon, the house had fallen silent. Jonathan made his way down the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing in the empty foyer. He paused outside the kitchen, hearing the soft murmur of voices. Peering in, he saw two of the household staff, Maria, the housekeeper, and Carlos, the chef, sitting at the small table reserved for their breaks. "Poor little Jack," Maria was saying, her voice heavy with sympathy. He waited up as long as he could, hoping his father would come down. Carlos shook his head. "It's not right," he muttered. "A man with all this money, and he can't even spare an hour for his own children." Jonathan withdrew before they could notice him, their words cutting deeper than any business setback ever had. He made his way to the family wing, pausing outside each bedroom door. From Mia's room, he could hear the soft sounds of music, something melancholic and introspective. He thought about knocking, about trying to bridge the gulf between them, but his hand fell away before he could summon the courage. At Jack's door, he lingered longer. The boy's nightlight cast a soft glow from beneath the door, and Jonathan could picture him curled up with his favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear that had been Jonathan's in his own childhood. How many bedtimes had he missed? How many stories had gone unread? Finally, he came to the master bedroom. He hesitated, his hand on the doorknob, before quietly entering. Evelyn was already in bed, her back to his side of the room. He couldn't tell if she was asleep or simply pretending to be to avoid another awkward interaction. As Jonathan prepared for bed, moving through his nightly routine with mechanical precision, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. He hardly recognized the man staring back at him. His hair was graying at the temples, lines of stress etched around his eyes and mouth. He looked every bit the successful businessman, but there was an emptiness in his eyes that no amount of money could fill. Sliding into bed beside Evelyn, Jonathan felt the vast emotional distance between them. It was a chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. He wanted to reach out, to bridge that gap, but he didn't know how. The skills that had made him a titan of industry were useless in the face of his crumbling family life. As he lay in the dark, sleep eluding him, Jonathan's mind raced with thoughts of the empire he had built. He had started with nothing, clawing his way up from a middle-class background to become one of the wealthiest men in the country. He had changed the face of technology, created jobs for thousands, and amassed a fortune that would last for generations. But at what cost? The question haunted him as he drifted into a restless sleep. In his dreams, he wandered the halls of his mansion, calling out for his family. But no matter how loudly he shouted, no one answered. He was alone in a gilded cage of his own making, the echoes of his voice the only company in the loneliest mansion in Beverly Hills. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Invitation. The following morning dawned bright and clear, the California sun casting a golden glow over the Greer estate. But within the walls of the mansion, a storm was brewing. Evelyn Greer stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her eyes fixed on the expansive backyard where Jack was half-heartedly kicking a soccer ball around by himself. At 39, Evelyn was still a striking woman. Her chestnut hair fell in soft waves around her face, and her deep brown eyes held a wisdom born of both joy and sorrow. But there was a weariness to her now, a sadness that seemed to cling to her like a second skin. She had spent years trying to hold her family together, to bridge the ever-widening gap between Jonathan and their children. But with each passing day, she felt more and more like she was fighting a losing battle. As she watched Jack, her heart ached. The little boy who had once been so full of life and laughter now seemed subdued, his movements lacking the exuberance of childhood. Evelyn knew he was feeling the absence of his father keenly. Jonathan had promised to play soccer with him this weekend, but as usual, work had gotten in the way. Another broken promise, another disappointment. The sound of footsteps pulled Evelyn from her reverie. She turned to see Mia entering the kitchen, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, her eyes still heavy with sleep. At 18, Mia was a beautiful young woman, with her mother's graceful features and her father's penetrating gaze. But there was a hardness to her now, a protective shell that had formed over years of disappointment and neglect. "Morning, Mom," Mia mumbled, making a beeline for the coffee maker. "Good morning, sweetheart," Evelyn replied, trying to infuse her voice with a cheerfulness she didn't feel. "Did you sleep well?" Mia shrugged, her back to her mother as she poured her coffee. "Same as always." Evelyn's heart sank at the dismissive tone. There had been a time when Mia would have greeted her with a hug, eager to share her dreams from the night before, or her plans for the day. Now their interactions were stilted, filled with unspoken tensions and resentments. "I was thinking," Evelyn began hesitantly, "maybe we could all have dinner together tonight, as a family." Mia turned, raising an eyebrow skeptically. "All of us? Including Dad?" The doubt in her daughter's voice was like a knife to Evelyn's heart. "Yes, including your father. I thought it might be nice to—" "To what, Mom?" Mia interrupted, her voice sharp. "Pretend we're a happy family for an hour before he rushes back to his precious work?" Evelyn flinched at the bitterness in Mia's words, but she couldn't deny the truth in them. How many family dinners had ended with Jonathan's phone ringing, pulling him away from them once again? "Mia, please," Evelyn said softly. "I know things have been difficult, but we have to keep trying. Your father loves you and Jack, even if he doesn't always show it well." Mia's expression softened slightly at the pleading tone in her mother's voice. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Fine," she conceded. "I'll be there, but don't expect miracles, Mom." As Mia left the kitchen, her coffee in hand, Evelyn turned back to the window. Jack had given up on his solitary game and was now sitting on the grass, absently plucking blades and tossing them aside. The sight steeled Evelyn's resolve. She couldn't let things continue as they were. Something had to change. With a deep breath, Evelyn made her way to Jonathan's home office. She hesitated outside the door, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. Then, with a soft knock, she entered. Jonathan was where she expected him to be, behind his desk, his attention focused on the multiple screens before him. He glanced up as she entered, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he schooled his features into a neutral expression. "Evelyn," he said, his tone somewhere between a greeting and a question, "is everything all right?" The fact that he assumed something must be wrong for her to seek him out in his office spoke volumes about the state of their relationship. Evelyn felt a wave of sadness wash over her, but she pushed it aside. She had a mission, and she couldn't let her emotions derail her. "Jonathan," she began, her voice steady despite the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. "We need to talk." Jonathan's brow furrowed, his eyes darting between Evelyn and his computer screens. "Can it wait? I'm in the middle of—" "No," Evelyn interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "It can't wait. That's the problem, Jonathan. It's always waiting. Our family is always waiting." Her words seemed to penetrate the bubble of work that constantly surrounded him. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, giving Evelyn his full attention for what felt like the first time in years. "What do you mean?" he asked, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. Evelyn took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I mean that we're losing you, Jonathan. The kids are growing up without a father, and I feel like I'm living with a stranger." She saw the shock register on his face, followed quickly by a flash of guilt before he masked his emotions once again. Evelyn, you know how important my work is. Everything I do is for this family. Is it? Evelyn challenged, her voice rising slightly. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like everything you do is for your company, for your legacy. When was the last time you had a real conversation with Mia? Do you even know what's going on in her life? And Jack, God, Jonathan, he worships the ground you walk on, but you're never there for him. Jonathan's jaw tightened, a mix of anger and shame warring in his eyes. That's not fair. I provide for this family. I've given you and the kids everything. Everything except you, Evelyn finished softly. We don't need your money, Jonathan. We need you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken frustrations and disappointments. Jonathan seemed to deflate, the facade of the powerful businessman crumbling to reveal a man who looked lost and uncertain. What do you want from me, Evelyn? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn stepped closer, her heart pounding. This was it, the moment she had been building towards for weeks. I want us to have dinner together tonight, as a family. No phones, no distractions. Just us. Jonathan's eyebrows rose in surprise. That's it? Just dinner? It's not just dinner, Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. It's a chance. A chance for you to see what you've been missing, what you're at risk of losing forever. She paused, gathering her courage for her final words. And it's an ultimatum, Jonathan. One last chance for us to be a family before I make a decision about our future. As Evelyn made her way back to the kitchen, her mind raced with thoughts of the evening ahead. She had set the wheels in motion, but now the weight of her decision pressed heavily upon her. What if Jonathan didn't show up? What if he did, but nothing changed? The possibilities swirled in her mind, a dizzying mix of hope and fear. She found Mia in the living room, curled up on the sofa with her sketchbook. The sight brought a small smile to Evelyn's face. Art had always been Mia's escape, her way of expressing the emotions she found difficult to voice. Mia, Evelyn said softly, not wanting to startle her daughter. Can we talk for a moment? Mia looked up, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. There was a wariness in her eyes that made Evelyn's heart ache. When had her vibrant, open daughter become so guarded? What's up, Mom? Mia asked, closing her sketchbook. Evelyn sat down beside her, taking a deep breath. I spoke with your father. We're having a family dinner tonight. Mia's eyebrows shot up in surprise. And he agreed? Just like that? He did, Evelyn confirmed, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. Mia, I know things have been difficult, but I need you to give this a chance. For all of us. Mia was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her sketchbook. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, vulnerable in a way Evelyn hadn't heard in years. Do you really think it will make a difference? The question hung in the air, heavy with years of disappointment and broken promises. Evelyn reached out, taking Mia's hand in hers. I don't know, sweetheart, but we have to try. Your father, he loves us. He's just lost his way a bit. Mia nodded, squeezing her mother's hand. Okay, Mom, I'll be there. And I'll try. Evelyn pulled her daughter into a hug, holding her close. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to being a family again. As the day wore on, a palpable tension filled the Greer mansion. Jack, sensing the importance of the evening, hovered near Evelyn as she moved through the house, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Is Dad really going to eat with us tonight? He asked for what felt like the 100th time. Evelyn knelt down to his level, smoothing his unruly hair. That's the plan, sweetheart. Why don't you go pick out something nice to wear? As Jack scampered off, Evelyn turned her attention to the dinner preparations. She had asked Carlos, their chef, to prepare Jonathan's favorite meal, a throwback to happier times when they would celebrate his successes as a family. The aroma of roasting beef and herbs filled the air, a tantalizing promise of the evening to come. In his office, Jonathan stared at his computer screen, the words blurring before his eyes. He couldn't focus, couldn't lose himself in work as he usually did. Evelyn's words echoed in his mind, the threat of losing his family finally penetrating the walls he had built around himself. He glanced at the clock. 5:30. In an hour and a half, he would be expected to sit down with his family, to be present in a way he hadn't been in years. The thought filled him with a strange mix of longing and dread. He wanted to connect with them, to bridge the chasms that had formed over years of neglect. But he didn't know how. The skills that had made him a titan of industry seemed woefully inadequate in the face of his family's needs. As the hour approached, the Greer family began to converge on the dining room. Mia arrived first, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing a simple sundress that made her look younger, more vulnerable. She fidgeted with the place settings, adjusting and readjusting the silverware with nervous energy. Jack bounded in next, his hair still damp from a hasty bath, wearing his good shirt, the one reserved for school pictures and special occasions. His eyes darted constantly to the doorway, eager for any sign of his father. Evelyn was the last to enter, having taken extra care with her appearance. She wore a dress that Jonathan had once told her brought out the warmth in her eyes, her hair falling in soft waves around her face. She looked beautiful, but there was a tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that betrayed her anxiety. As 7 o'clock approached, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Jack's excited chatter had dwindled to nervous glances at the door. Mia sat rigid in her chair, her fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the table. Evelyn found herself holding her breath, straining to hear the sound of Jonathan's footsteps in the hallway. The grandfather clock in the foyer began to chime, its deep tones echoing through the house. 1, 2, 3. With each chime, the hope in Jack's eyes dimmed a little more. By the 5th chime, Mia's expression had hardened into a mask of resigned disappointment. 6, 7. As the final chime faded away, Evelyn felt something inside her crumble. She opened her mouth, searching for words to soothe her children's disappointment, to explain away their father's absence once again. But before she could speak, the sound of hurried footsteps filled the silence. And then, slightly out of breath and with an uncharacteristic look of uncertainty on his face, Jonathan appeared in the doorway. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm here now. I'm here." The Greer family stared at him, a tableau of shock and cautious hope. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the future of their family hanging in the balance of this unexpected moment. And then, breaking the spell, Jack leapt from his chair with a cry of, "Dad!" and threw himself into Jonathan's arms. As Jonathan caught his son holding him close with a fierceness that surprised even himself, something shifted in the room. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Evelyn met Jonathan's eyes over Jack's head, seeing in them a mix of guilt, fear, and a desperate desire to make things right. She gave him a small nod, an acknowledgement of this first step. As Jonathan took his seat at the table, the tension in the room began to shift. It was still there, humming beneath the surface, but now it was tinged with something else, a fragile, tentative hope. The Greer family was together at last, poised on the edge of a new beginning. But as Carlos began to serve the carefully prepared meal, the question remained, would this dinner be enough to bridge the chasms between them? Or was it too little, too late? The answers would unfold over the next few hours, in a meal that would change the course of their lives forever. Chapter 3. A meal of silence and tension. The Greer family dining room, with its high ceilings and elegant furnishings, had never felt so small. As Carlos, their longtime chef, began to serve the first course, the silence that enveloped the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. The gentle clink of silverware against fine china seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the stillness. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, his usual commanding presence diminished by the palpable awkwardness of the situation. He fidgeted with his napkin, his eyes darting between his wife and children, searching for a way to break the ice. In all his years of high-stakes business negotiations, he had never felt so out of his depth. Evelyn, seated to his right, maintained a composed facade, but the slight tremor in her hand as she raised her water glass betrayed her inner turmoil. She had orchestrated this dinner, had laid down the ultimatum that brought them all to this moment. Now, faced with the reality of it, she found herself at a loss for words. Mia, directly across from her mother, sat ramrod straight in her chair, her posture a physical manifestation of the walls she had built around herself. She pushed her food around her plate, her appetite seemingly vanished in the face of this forced family gathering. Only Jack, in his innocence, seemed oblivious to the tension. He dug into his meal with gusto, his legs swinging happily under the table. Every so often he would glance up at his father with a look of pure adoration, as if he couldn't quite believe Jonathan was really there. As the silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing moment, Jonathan cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him, a mixture of wariness and hope evident in their expressions. "So," he began, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room, How is everyone doing?" The question, so commonplace in normal families, but so foreign in theirs, hung in the air. Mia let out a soft snort, quickly disguised as a cough, while Evelyn's eyes widened slightly at the awkward attempt at conversation. It was Jack who finally broke the silence, his childish enthusiasm cutting through the tension like a ray of sunshine through storm clouds. "I'm great, Dad. I scored a goal in soccer practice yesterday. Coach says I might even start in the next game." Jonathan latched onto this lifeline, grateful for any topic of conversation. "That's wonderful, Jack. I didn't know you were playing soccer. When did you start?" The moment the words left his mouth, Jonathan realized his mistake. Jack's face fell and Evelyn's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. "I've been playing for 2 seasons, Dad," Jack said quietly. His earlier excitement dimmed. "I told you about it last year, remember? You said you'd come watch me play." The unspoken accusation in those words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He remembered now, a vague conversation, a distracted promise made while his mind was on a dozen other things. A promise he had promptly forgotten, like so many others. "I'm sorry, Jack," Jonathan said, the words feeling woefully inadequate. I should have been there." Mia's fork clattered against her plate, drawing everyone's attention. Her eyes, when she looked at her father, were hard and accusing. "You should have been there for a lot of things, Dad." "Mia," Evelyn warned softly, but Jonathan held up a hand. "No, it's okay," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "She's right. I haven't been there for any of you." The admission hung in the air, heavy with years of missed recitals, forgotten games, and absent parenting. For a moment, no one seemed to know how to respond to this unexpected vulnerability from the family patriarch. Evelyn, ever the peacemaker, attempted to steer the conversation to safer waters. "Mia, why don't you tell your father about your art project, the one you've been working on for school?" Mia's eyes flicked to her mother, a silent battle of wills taking place in that brief glance. Finally, with a small sigh, she turned to Jonathan. "It's a series of portraits," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "exploring the theme of isolation in the digital age." Jonathan leaned forward, genuinely interested despite the underlying tension. "That sounds fascinating, Mia. I'd love to see them sometime." "Really?" Mia couldn't keep the skepticism out of her voice. "You want to see my art?" The disbelief in her tone was like a knife to Jonathan's heart. Had he really become so disconnected from his daughter's life that she couldn't believe he'd be interested in her passions? "Of course I do," he said softly. "I know I haven't. I haven't been as involved as I should have been. But I want to change that, if you'll let me." Mia held his gaze for a long moment, searching for sincerity in his eyes. Whatever she saw there seemed to soften her expression slightly, though the wall she had built remained firmly in place. "Maybe," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "if you really mean it this time." The cautious hope in her words was both a lifeline and an indictment. Jonathan nodded, not trusting himself to speak past the lump that had formed in his throat. As Carlos cleared the main course and prepared to serve dessert, a heavy silence once again descended upon the table. The brief moments of connection had been like islands in a vast sea of unspoken words and buried emotions. Now, as the meal drew to a close, the weight of all that remained unsaid pressed down on them all. Evelyn watched her family with a mixture of hope and heartache. She had wanted this dinner to be a turning point, a chance for them to reconnect and heal. But as she looked at the strained faces around the table, she wondered if she had been naive to think one meal could bridge the chasms years of neglect had created. Jonathan, for his part, felt increasingly out of his depth. In the boardroom, he was a master of reading people, of knowing exactly what to say to close a deal or sway an investor. But here, faced with the raw emotions of his own family, he found himself floundering. As Carlos set a beautifully crafted chocolate mousse in front of each of them, Jonathan's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a reflexive action, born of years of prioritizing work above all else, that made him reach for it. The reaction from his family was immediate and visceral. Mia's face hardened, her brief moment of openness snapping shut like a steel trap. Jack's shoulders slumped, disappointment written across his young features. And Evelyn, the look in her eyes was one of resigned heartbreak, as if she had been expecting this all along but had allowed herself to hope for something different. Jonathan's hand froze halfway to his pocket, the realization of what he had been about to do hitting him like a physical blow. This was it, he realized. This was the moment Evelyn had warned him about, the precipice on which their family stood. With a deliberate slowness, he withdrew his hand from his pocket, leaving the phone untouched. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. That was unacceptable. This time is for us. Nothing else matters right now." The tension in the room, which had ratcheted up to an almost unbearable level, eased slightly at his words. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement, a step in the right direction. Evelyn reached out, placing her hand over Jonathan's on the table. It was the first time they had touched all evening, and the contact sent a jolt through both of them. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. As they began to eat their dessert, the silence that fell was different from before. Still awkward, still laden with unresolved issues, but no longer quite so oppressive. It was a silence filled with possibility, with the tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Jack, finishing his mousse with childish enthusiasm, looked up at his father with chocolate smeared around his mouth. The realization of what he had been about to do hitting him like a physical blow. This was it, he realized. This was the moment Evelyn had warned him about, the precipice on which their family stood. With a deliberate slowness, he withdrew his hand from his pocket, leaving the phone untouched. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. That was unacceptable. This time is for us. Nothing else matters right now." The tension in the room, which had ratcheted up to an almost unbearable level, eased slightly at his words. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement, a step in the right direction. Evelyn reached out, placing her hand over Jonathan's on the table. It was the first time they had touched all evening, and the contact sent a jolt through both of them. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. As they began to eat their dessert, the silence that fell was different from before. Still awkward, still laden with unresolved issues, but no longer quite so oppressive. It was a silence filled with possibility, with the tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Jack, finishing his mousse with childish enthusiasm, looked up at his father with chocolate smeared around his mouth. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying the innocence of youth, "will you read me a bedtime story tonight, like you used to?" The question, so simple and yet so loaded with meaning, hung in the air. Jonathan felt the eyes of his entire family on him, waiting to see how he would respond. In that moment, he realized that this was about more than just a bedtime story. It was about showing up, being present, choosing his family over the constant demands of his work. I'd love to, Jack, Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. In fact, why don't we make it a family story time? We could all use a little magic before bed, I think. The suggestion was met with surprised looks from Evelyn and Mia. It was so unlike the Jonathan they had come to know over the past few years, the distant workaholic who rarely had time for family activities. Mia, her expression a mixture of skepticism and a flicker of the child she once was, spoke up. Even me? Aren't I too old for bedtime stories? Jonathan met his daughter's gaze, seeing in her eyes the little girl who used to beg him for just one more story before bed. You're never too old for a good story, he said softly, especially when it's shared with family. As they finished their dessert, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The tension that had defined the evening hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had eased. In its place was something fragile and tentative, a spark of hope, a possibility of change. They stood from the table, the dinner officially over, but the evening not yet concluded. As they made their way to Jack's room for the promised story time, Jonathan felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Fear, hope, regret, and determination all swirled within him. He didn't know if one dinner, one bedtime story, could begin to make up for years of absence and neglect. But as he followed his family down the hallway, Jack's small hand trustingly in his, Evelyn's gentle presence at his side, and Mia's cautious glances over her shoulder, Jonathan knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was his chance, perhaps his last chance, to be the father and husband his family deserved, and he was determined not to waste it. As they settled into Jack's room, gathering on and around the bed like they used to years ago, Jonathan reached for the well-worn copy of The Little Prince on the nightstand. It had been his favorite book as a child, and he had passed that love on to his own children in those early years before work had consumed him. Opening the book, feeling the weight of his family's expectations and hopes, Jonathan began to read. Once, when I was 6 years old, I saw a magnificent picture in a book called True Stories from Nature, about the primeval forest. As the familiar words filled the room, weaving their magic around the Greer family, a fragile peace settled over them. It wasn't a solution to all their problems, not by far. But it was a beginning, a small step towards healing the wounds that had torn them apart. In that moment, as Jonathan's voice brought the story to life, and his family listened with rapt attention, they were no longer the disconnected, fractured unit they had become. They were simply a family, sharing a moment of warmth and connection. It was a small victory, but a significant one. And as Jonathan read on, he silently vowed to himself that it would be the first of many such moments. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. Not alone, but with his family by his side. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. As Jonathan's voice faded on the last words of The Little Prince, a hushed silence fell over the room. Jack had drifted off to sleep, his small form curled against his father's side. Mia sat at the foot of the bed, her knees drawn up to her chest, an unreadable expression on her face. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, no one moved, as if they were all afraid to break the spell that had settled over them. It was Mia who finally stirred, uncurling herself from her position and standing up. "I should go to bed," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of emotions, longing, hesitation, and a lingering trace of resentment. "I have an early class tomorrow." Jonathan looked up, meeting his daughter's eyes. "Mia," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I thank you for being here tonight, for giving this a chance." Mia nodded, a small, tight movement. "Yeah, well, good night," she murmured, slipping out of the room before anyone could respond. As her footsteps faded down the hall, Evelyn moved into the room, gently lifting Jack from Jonathan's side. "I'll put him to bed properly," she whispered, cradling their son against her chest. Jonathan stood, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from sitting in one position for so long. As Evelyn tucked Jack in, he found himself drawn to the small desk in the corner of the room. It was covered in drawings, bright, childish scribbles of stick figures and houses with smoke curling from chimneys. One drawing in particular caught his eye. 4 figures stood hand in hand, a tall man in a suit, a woman with long hair, a girl with a ponytail, and a small boy. Above them, in wobbly letters, were the words, "My family." Jonathan's throat tightened as he stared at the picture. This was how Jack saw them, not as the fractured, disconnected unit they had become, but as a loving, united family. The innocence and hope in that simple drawing hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He drew that last week. Evelyn's soft voice came from behind him. His teacher asked them to draw their families. Jonathan turned to face his wife, the drawing still clutched in his hand. "Evelyn, he began, but the words caught in his throat. Evelyn's eyes were tired, but there was a softness in them that Jonathan hadn't seen in years. "I know," she said simply. "Come on, let's talk downstairs. We don't want to wake Jack." They made their way to the living room in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy between them. As they sat on opposite ends of the sofa, Jonathan was struck by the physical distance between them, a tangible representation of the emotional chasm that had grown over the years. "I've made so many mistakes," Jonathan said quietly, breaking the silence. "I don't even know where to begin to make things right." Evelyn sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Jonathan, it was a start. But one dinner, one bedtime story, it doesn't erase years of absence." "I know," Jonathan nodded, his voice heavy with regret. "But I want to try, Evelyn. I want to be the husband and father you all deserve." "Do you?" Evelyn's voice was sharp, the pain and frustration of years finally bubbling to the surface. "Because we've been here before, Jonathan. You make promises, you say you'll change, and then the next big deal comes along and we're right back where we started." The accusation stung, but Jonathan couldn't deny the truth in her words. How many times had he vowed to do better, only to let work pull him away again? "It's different this time," he said, trying to infuse his voice with all the sincerity and determination he felt. "I see now what I've been risking, what I've already lost. I can't lose you, any of you." Evelyn's eyes softened slightly, but the wariness remained. "Words are easy, Jonathan. It's the follow-through that's always been the problem." "Then tell me what to do," Jonathan pleaded, leaning forward. "Tell me how to fix this, how to be the man you married again." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on some distant point. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you remember why you started the company?" The question caught Jonathan off guard. To provide for our family, to secure our future." Evelyn shook her head, a sad smile playing at her lips. "No, that came later. In the beginning, it was about changing the world, making a difference. You were so passionate, so driven, not by money or power, but by the desire to create something meaningful." Jonathan felt a pang of nostalgia for the man he had once been, young, idealistic, burning with the desire to leave his mark on the world. "Somewhere along the way," Evelyn continued, "you lost sight of that. The company became an end in itself, not a means to a greater purpose. And we became collateral damage in your pursuit of success." The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, to defend himself, but found he had no words. Because deep down, he knew she was right. "I don't need you to be a billionaire, Jonathan," Evelyn said, her voice cracking slightly. "The kids don't need a father who can buy them anything they want. We need you, present, engaged, part of our lives." "I want that too," Jonathan said softly. "More than anything." Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. "Then prove it," she said simply. "Not with grand gestures or expensive gifts. Prove it by being here day after day, by knowing what's going on in your children's lives, by being a partner to me, not just a provider." The challenge in her words was clear. This was it, the moment that would define their future as a family. Jonathan felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. "I will," he said, his voice firm with resolve. "I swear to you, Evelyn, I will do whatever it takes to make this right." Evelyn nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I want to believe you, Jonathan, but it's going to take time and consistent effort." "I understand," Jonathan said, "and I'm ready for that, for all of it." As they sat there, the silence between them no longer felt oppressive. It was filled with possibility, with the tentative hope of a new beginning. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Just as they were about to reach for each other, to bridge the physical gap between them, a sharp cry shattered the quiet of the night. "Mom! Dad!" It was Jack's voice, high and panicked in a way they had never heard before. In an instant, they were on their feet, racing towards their son's room. As they burst through the door, they found Jack sitting up in bed, his face pale and contorted with pain, one hand clutching at his chest. "It hurts," he gasped, tears streaming down his face. "My chest. It hurts so much." Time seemed to slow down as the reality of the situation hit them. Their little boy, their Jack, was in serious trouble. In that moment, all the tensions and conflicts of the evening fell away. They were no longer a fractured family struggling to reconnect. They were simply parents, united in their fear and love for their child. As Evelyn rushed to Jack's side, gathering him in her arms, Jonathan was already on the phone, his voice sharp with urgency as he called for an ambulance. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Mia appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of confusion and fear. Evelyn tried to comfort Jack, her own voice shaking as she whispered soothing words. Jonathan paced the room, his eyes never leaving his son as he relayed information to the emergency dispatcher. And through it all, Jack's labored breathing filled the room, each gasp a reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could change. As the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached the house, the Greer family huddled together around Jack's bed. In that moment of crisis, they were more united than they had been in years. But as the paramedics rushed in, their efficient movements a stark contrast to the family's panic, one thought echoed in Jonathan's mind. Would this be the wake-up call they needed? Or would it be the final blow to their already fragile family? As Jack was carefully loaded onto a stretcher, his small hand reaching out for his parents, Jonathan and Evelyn exchanged a look. In that silent communication, a promise passed between them. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The family followed the paramedics out of the house, the cool night air a shock against their skin. As they climbed into their car to follow the ambulance, the gravity of the situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. Their evening had started with a dinner meant to heal their family. Now, as they sped through the dark streets towards the hospital, they found themselves praying for a different kind of healing altogether. The future of the Greer family hung in the balance, their fate tied to the rapid beeping of a heart monitor and the shallow breaths of a little boy who had brought them together in crisis. As the hospital loomed ahead, they could only hope that this unexpected turn of events would be the catalyst for the change they so desperately needed. Chapter 5. The Unexpected Miracle. The stark white walls of the hospital waiting room seemed to close in around the Greer family as they huddled together, the seconds ticking by with agonizing slowness. The smell of antiseptic hung heavily in the air, mingling with the underlying current of fear and anxiety that permeated the space. Jonathan paced restlessly, his usually composed demeanor crumbling under the weight of worry and helplessness. Every few moments, his eyes would dart to the doors leading to the emergency room, willing them to open with news of Jack. Evelyn sat rigidly in an uncomfortable plastic chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but now they were dry, fixed on some distant point as she silently prayed for her son. Mia, curled up in a chair next to her mother, looked smaller and younger than her 18 years. The walls she had built up over years of resentment and neglect had crumbled in the face of this family crisis. Now she simply looked scared, her usual air of defiance replaced by raw vulnerability. As the minutes stretched into hours, the Greer family found themselves drawing closer together, both physically and emotionally. Jonathan ceased his pacing and took the seat next to Evelyn, hesitantly reaching out to take her hand. To his surprise and relief, she didn't pull away. Instead, she gripped his hand tightly, as if it were a lifeline in a stormy sea. Mia, watching this small gesture of connection between her parents, felt a lump form in her throat. Slowly, she uncurled herself and leaned against her mother's shoulder. Evelyn's free arm immediately wrapped around her daughter, pulling her close. In that moment, surrounded by the harsh fluorescent lights and the quiet bustle of the hospital at night, the Greer family was more united than they had been in years. The petty grievances and long-held resentments that had divided them seemed insignificant in the face of potentially losing Jack. It was nearly dawn when the doctor finally emerged, his face serious but not grim. The Greers stood as one, hearts pounding as they waited for news. "Mr. and Mrs. Greer," the doctor began, his voice calm and measured, "your son is stable. We've run a series of tests, and I'm afraid Jack has a congenital heart condition that we've only just discovered." The words hit the family like a physical blow. Evelyn let out a choked sob, while Jonathan's face paled visibly. "A heart condition?" Mia whispered, her voice small and frightened. The doctor nodded solemnly. "It's a rare condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It causes the heart muscle to become abnormally thick, which can make it harder for the heart to pump blood." "But he's always been so healthy," Jonathan protested weakly. "How could we not have known?" "Unfortunately, this condition can go undetected for years," the doctor explained. "In Jack's case, the stress of recent events may have triggered the episode we saw tonight. In a way, this crisis may have saved his life by bringing the condition to our attention early." The irony of the doctor's words was not lost on the Greers. The family dinner that was meant to heal their emotional wounds had inadvertently led to the discovery of Jack's physical condition. "What happens now?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling but determined. "We'll need to start Jack on medication immediately," the doctor said. "He'll also need to be monitored regularly and may need to make some lifestyle changes. But with proper management, many people with this condition lead full, active lives." As the doctor continued to explain Jack's treatment plan, a strange mix of emotions washed over the Greer family. There was fear, certainly, at the challenges that lay ahead. But there was also an overwhelming sense of relief and gratitude that Jack was alive, that they had been given this chance. When they were finally allowed to see Jack, they entered his room as a united front. The sight of their little boy, small and pale against the stark white hospital sheets, with wires and monitors attached to his chest, brought fresh tears to their eyes. But Jack, ever resilient, managed a weak smile when he saw them. "Hi," he said softly, his voice hoarse but cheerful. "Did you guys have a sleepover at the hospital too?" A choked laugh escaped Evelyn as she rushed to Jack's bedside, gathering him gently in her arms. Jonathan was right behind her, one hand on Jack's shoulder, the other around Evelyn's waist. Mia clambered onto the bed on Jack's other side, careful not to disturb any of the medical equipment. As they surrounded Jack with their love, murmuring words of comfort and reassurance, something fundamental shifted within the Greer family. The crisis had stripped away their pretenses and defenses, leaving only the raw, unshakable core of their love for each other. In the days that followed, as Jack began his recovery and the family adjusted to their new reality, the changes that had begun that fateful night continued to unfold. Jonathan, shaken to his core by how close he had come to losing his son, made good on his promises to prioritize his family. He delegated more responsibilities at work, set strict boundaries on his hours, and made it a point to be present for every doctor's appointment, every family meal, every moment that mattered. Evelyn, seeing the genuine effort Jonathan was making, began to let down her guard. The warmth and connection that had characterized their early years together slowly began to reignite. Mia, witnessing the changes in her parents and feeling the shift in the family dynamic, found herself opening up more. She shared her art with her father, allowed her mother to comfort her in moments of vulnerability, and formed a closer bond with Jack, fiercely protective of her little brother. And Jack, despite the challenges of his condition, thrived under the love and attention of his family. His resilience and optimism became a source of strength for all of them. 6 months after that life-changing night, the Greer family once again sat down to dinner together. But this time, There was no tension, no awkward silences. Instead, the room was filled with the warmth of genuine conversation, punctuated by laughter and the occasional playful argument. As Jonathan looked around the table at his wife and children, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had been given a second chance, not just with Jack's health, but with their family as a whole. The journey hadn't been easy, and he knew there would be challenges ahead. But as he met Evelyn's eyes across the table and saw the love and trust reflected there, he knew that they would face whatever came next together. The Greer family had been broken, but through crisis and commitment, they had found their way back to each other. Their story was far from over, but now, at last, they were writing it together. As the evening wore on, filled with shared stories and plans for the future, one thing became clear. The loneliest mansion in Beverly Hills was lonely no more. It had become a true home, filled with the love, laughter, and connection that the Greer family had rediscovered. And in that rediscovery, they had found something precious and unbreakable: the strength of a family united, ready to face whatever life might bring, together.